TEKS. The TEKS for this lesson is government. The student understands the concept of federalism. The student is expected to explain why the founding fathers created a distinctly new form of federalism and adopted a federal system of government instead of a unitary system. B, categorize government powers as national, state, or shared. C, analyze historical and contemporary conflicts over the respective roles of national and state governments. And D, understand the limits on the national and state governments in the U.S. federal system of government. The chapter is on federalism, and the first lesson in the chapter is dividing and sharing power. A question that should be asked throughout the chapter is, why and how is power divided among national, state, and local governments? So why does the United States use federalism as its government? When the framers of the United States were creating the government in 1787, they were faced with a dilemma of what type of government they should use. They had to decide how they were going to make a government that united 13 independent states into one nation. When they did this, it still had to protect the liberties of the American people from a centralized government. As a result, they would make federalism. Federalism was an entirely new kind of government. So the Americans invented federalism. In federalism, two or more governments exercise power over the same people and the same territory. In the United States government, each part of the government has special powers over its citizens. The states have certain powers allowed just for them, and it also shares some powers with the national government. It took 2 centuries for the government to develop its system. Before the Constitution could become the official law of the land, it had to be approved by all 13 colonies. And while the states were trying to decide if the Constitution would become the law of the land, there were state officials who weren't sure if they wanted the Constitution to be the official law of the land, because they weren't sure about how much power that they wanted the national government to have. They weren't sure if the national government would ignore the sovereignty of the states, or if they would tax the states unfairly. And they were nervous about that because the British had done it before. There were people who supported the federalism. Some examples of people who supported federalism were John Jay and Alexander Hamilton. And, John Jay and Alexander Hamilton had to convince the other state leaders that the Constitution set up a system that would give good power to the national and state governments, and that it was a reasonable way of doing it. In the document The Federalist Number 9, Alexander Hamilton was able to convince the state leaders that the Constitution was an effective way of governing the people. And this primary source that Alexander Hamilton wrote from the Federalist, or in the Federalist Number 9, Alexander Hamilton wrote, "The proposed Constitution, so far from implying an abolition of the state governments, makes them constituent parts of the national sovereignty, by allowing them a direct representation in the Senate, and leaves in their possession certain exclusive and very important portions of sovereign power. This fully corresponds with the idea of a federal government." Alexander Hamilton, 1787. An important question to ask when discussing federalism is, what roles should the national, state, and local governments have? One thing that you can do to solve that problem is to ask what problems should be addressed by the local, state, and or national government. The Constitution was ratified, and it adopted the federal model for dividing and sharing power. So the United States would share power throughout the different governments, or the different levels of government. I'm working on the thing. Even today, government officials and people still disagree about what the right formula for dividing and sharing power is in the United States. Another part of dividing and sharing power is federalism in the Constitution. So the Constitution, it divides government authority. It does that by giving the national government certain powers, and then all the other powers it gives to the states or to the people. The national and the state governments share some powers, and the Constitution also denies some powers to the state from the states and the national government. There's also national powers. The Constitution gives both implied powers and express powers to the national government. Together, these powers are known as delegated powers. So the Constitution grants or gives powers to the national government. Okay, so that is the end of the content presentation.